When you picture the Ottoman Empire, do you imagine golden domes, brilliant generals, and wise sultans ruling with dignity? Good, because that's not the story you're about to hear. What if I told you that behind the silk robes and marble palaces lurked rulers with habits so grotesque they could make a sewer rat lose its appetite? Would you trust a leader who drank himself unconscious while lecturing the court about discipline? Or respect a sultan who treated fratricide like a weekend chore? What about one who stuffed his palace with concubines only to kill them out of sheer boredom? These weren't minor quirks. They were personal obsessions so vile that they warped the empire itself. History loves to glorify the Ottomans for their mosques, conquests, and culture. But how often do you hear about the Sultan nicknamed the Drunk, or the one who drowned his paranoia in rivers of blood? Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain and peek into a world of indulgence, madness, and filth, where the most powerful men on earth often couldn't control their own twisted cravings. So brace yourself. The Ottomans built an empire of splendor, but their rulers built reputations of pure grotesque. Mehmed II is remembered as the brilliant young sultan who took Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire and crowning himself the conqueror. History books usually stop there, painting him as a genius of strategy, a visionary ruler, and the man who reshaped world history. What they politely avoid mentioning is that living under Mehmed could be as nauseating as watching him eat. This man didn't just conquer cities, he conquered entire banquet tables. His appetite was legendary, not just for food, but for excess in every imaginable form. Picture a ruler who would devour roasted lambs, mountains of sweets, and gallons of sherbet as though tomorrow didn't exist. Courtiers whispered that he ate like a man trying to outlive death itself, though the only thing really dying was the dignity of anyone forced to watch him chew. And when his stomach wasn't the battlefield, his paranoia was. Mehmed had a charming little family tradition, executing rivals, brothers, and even loyal servants if he sensed the slightest threat. Nothing says good morning quite like watching your sibling strangled with a bowstring before breakfast. He was also obsessed with power plays that bordered on grotesque theatre. Mehmed collected scholars and artists, yes, but he also collected enemies' heads, sometimes literally, displayed as if they were trophies in his imperial man cave. To his admirers, he was the new Alexander the Great. To those who lived with him, he was Alexander with terrible table manners and an execution fetish. Mehmed's reign set the tone, brilliance wrapped in brutality, intellect spiced with gluttony, an empire built on blood. The world remembers him for his empire building. His court probably remembers him for the smell of overcooked meat and fear of sudden strangulation. If you thought Mehmed's appetite was grotesque, wait until you meet Selim. He preferred blood over lamb chops. If Mehmed the Sad had a problem with overeating, his grandson Selim I had a taste for something far more unsettling: blood. Known to history as Selim the Grim, he didn't earn that nickname for his sparkling personality. This was a man who thought empire building required not just conquest, but an industrial-level slaughter of family members. Forget awkward family dinners, Selim made sure there were fewer relatives to invite in the first place. Upon taking power, he cleared the table by executing brothers, nephews, and anyone who might so much as blink in his direction with ambition. But Selim wasn't just paranoid, he was theatrically cruel. He's remembered for expanding Ottoman territories into Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula, securing the title of caliph. Yet in his own court, whispers spread that he treated executions like entertainment. Imagine a ruler who believed empire building was best paired with public strangulations and gallons of red wine. Yes, he drank heavily too, proving that terror and intoxication make a truly charming leadership duo. Selim also loved war like some people love dessert. While other rulers might savor diplomacy, Selim charged straight into battle with a sword in one hand and paranoia in the other. His soldiers admired his ruthlessness, but his victims probably weren't sending thank-you notes. The empire grew under his reign, but so did the sense that the Ottoman throne was occupied by a man who considered mercy a four-letter word. In the end, Selim left behind an empire stronger on the map, but weaker in trust. His legacy is a reminder that cruelty may build walls, but it also poisons the foundation beneath them. If Selim's bloodlust leaves you uneasy, wait until you meet Murad IV. He banned coffee, but drank terror. And tell me in the comments, would you survive under a sultan this grim? Murad IV is remembered as the sultan who tried to run the empire like a particularly violent boarding school. His rules were strict, his punishments were brutal, and his hypocrisy could win an Olympic medal. Officially, Murad was famous for banning alcohol, tobacco, and even coffee. Yes, coffee. The lifeblood of half the empire. Anyone caught sipping a cup could face the ultimate penalty. To him, a steaming mug wasn't a drink, it was an act of treason. But here's the punchline. While his subjects trembled at the thought of a casual coffee break, Murad himself indulged in the very vices he outlawed. Reports say he drank heavily and enjoyed the forbidden pleasures in private while executing commoners for the same crimes. Picture the scene. A sultan staggering through his palace after a night of wine, while in the streets men lost their heads over a single whiff of tobacco. Murad's reign was also drenched in violence outside the palace walls. He was personally known to ride through the city at night in disguise, catching citizens in the act of breaking his absurd bans. What followed was often swift execution. Imagine your local mayor sneaking around at midnight with a sword, ready to kill you for drinking espresso. That was daily life under Murad. Despite his paranoia and bloodthirsty discipline, Murad was also a formidable military leader. He crushed rebellions and led the Ottomans to victory in Persia. Yet his empire felt less like a home and more like a haunted house patrolled by a caffeine-hating tyrant. In the end, Murad IV embodied the paradox of Ottoman power, a ruler who demanded purity yet indulged in filth, who sought order yet ruled through chaos. His subjects didn't just lose freedoms, they lost the right to drink coffee without fearing a sword at their throat. If Murad's midnight patrols sound terrifying, wait until you meet Ibrahim the Mad. His grotesque appetites made Murad's hypocrisy look almost polite. If Murad IV was obsessed with banning pleasures, his successor, Ibrahim the Firm, swung the pendulum to the opposite extreme, straight into absolute madness. History remembers him as Ibrahim the Mad, and for once, the nickname doesn't feel exaggerated. He spent much of his early life locked up in the palace, marinating in paranoia and isolation. When finally released to rule, Ibrahim treated power not as responsibility, but as an all-you-can-eat buffet of grotesque indulgence. His reign quickly became infamous for extravagance. He demanded enormous feasts, drowning in sweets and delicacies, not for the empire's glory, but for his own bloated appetite. And when he wasn't devouring food, he was devouring wealth. He ordered fur-lined rooms in the palace, even in the sweltering summer, simply because he liked the texture. Imagine taxpayers sweating outside while their ruler lounged on fur carpets like a spoiled cat. But Ibrahim's most grotesque obsession was with women. He filled his harem with hundreds of concubines, yet paranoia drove him to execute many of them on mere suspicion of betrayal. In one of his most infamous acts, he ordered the drowning of over 200 concubines, claiming they were unfaithful. His personal fears translated into mass cruelty, turning the palace into a theatre of horror. By the end of his reign, the empire was less impressed with his conquests than appalled by his madness. Ministers and soldiers alike saw a man lost to paranoia, indulgence, and violence, a sultan who confused leadership with lunacy. If Ibrahim's drowning spree makes your skin crawl, just wait for Mustafa the Faih. Madness ran in the family. And while you're here, drop a comment. Which of these habits do you find most grotesque so far? If Ibrahim, I turned the palace into a madhouse. Mustafa, I proved that insanity was practically a hereditary job requirement. Twice he sat on the Ottoman throne, and twice his reign collapsed into chaos. Historians often describe him as mentally unstable, but that polite phrase doesn't capture the reality of a man who treated ruling like a bizarre hobby he was never qualified to have. Mustafa had spent years locked in the infamous cage, a gilded prison where potential heirs were kept isolated to prevent rebellion. By the time he was crowned, the damage was done. He shuffled through the palace in a haze, muttering to himself, unable to focus on the affairs of state. Ministers quickly realized that decisions were less about strategy and more about the sultan's mood swings. Imagine your country run by a man who couldn't decide whether to eat breakfast, let alone lead an empire. His paranoia was legendary. Mustafa would order executions at random, then later weep over the deaths he had commanded. His grip on reality slipped in and out, making him dangerous one moment and pitiful the next. In one infamous scene, he supposedly tried to fish out coins from the palace fountains, convinced the empire's treasury was hiding in the water. This was less leadership and more a tragic comedy routine performed at the expense of millions. By the end of his second reign, Mustafa had earned his title, the Mad, not through brilliance warped by paranoia, but through sheer incompetence dressed in royal robes. His courtiers learned to survive not by loyalty, but by guessing whether today's sultan was violent or vacant. If Mustafa's confusion sounds absurd, prepare yourself. Selim Seti. The drunk will prove that wine can rule just as disastrously as madness. After Mustafa's madness, you might think the empire would sober up. Unfortunately, the Ottomans got Selim II, better known as the Drunk. Unlike his warrior father, Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim had little interest in battles or strategy. His favorite weapon was not the sword, but the wine jug. Imagine an empire run not from the saddle of a horse, but from the bottom of a goblet. Selim's love affair with alcohol was legendary. While his armies marched across continents, he staggered across palace floors, leaving statesmen and generals to pick up the slack. Advisors complained that he preferred wine cellars over war councils, and when he did appear in public, he often looked less like a sultan and more like someone tossed out of a tavern. His reign became a standing joke. The empire expanded, but the man at its head shrank into drunken stupor. Of course, heavy drinking alone wasn't enough to define Selim. He surrounded himself with favorites and courtiers who exploited his addictions. Corruption spread through the palace like spilled wine on a carpet, staining everything it touched. Some historians even argue that his negligence began the slow decline of Ottoman discipline, trading sober governance for intoxicated indulgence, and then came his infamous death. Selim reportedly slipped, drunk, in his own bathhouse and struck his head, an exit both humiliating and perfectly in character. The man who drank away his empire couldn't even leave the stage without turning it into a tragic comedy. If Selim's drunken downfall feels pathetic, just wait until you meet Mehmed III, the man who thought mass fratricide was a healthy morning routine. And tell me in the comments which is worse for an empire, madness or drunkenness. If Selim Seku drowned in wine, Mehmed III drowned in blood, specifically the blood of his own family. Upon taking the throne in 1595, Mehmed faced the usual Ottoman problem: too many brothers, not enough thrones. His solution was as grotesque as it was efficient. He ordered the strangulation of 19 of his brothers in a single sweep, transforming the palace nursery into a morgue overnight. Imagine family game night ending with everyone except the winner buried in the garden. Mehmed justified this horror as necessary for stability, following the brutal Ottoman practice of fratricide. But even by those grim standards, his body count was excessive. Courtiers whispered that the palace echoed with cries of infants and young boys dragged away by executioners with bowstrings. The empire may have gained security, but it lost every shred of humanity in the process. And it didn't stop there. Mehmed carried his appetite for violence onto the battlefield. In the long war against the Habsburgs, he reportedly ordered massacres that horrified even hardened soldiers. His leadership style was simple: fewer rivals, fewer enemies, fewer witnesses. He was the kind of ruler who solved problems by making sure nobody was left alive to cause them again. Despite this cruelty, Mehmed lacked the charisma or brilliance of earlier sultans. He ruled with fear, not vision, leaving behind a court drenched in paranoia. His reign is remembered less for achievements than for the suffocating shadow of mass murder. If 19 brothers strangled sounds excessive, brace yourself. Osman II will show you how arrogance and youth can ruin an empire just as effectively. If Mehmed III proved that paranoia could strangle an empire, Osman II showed that arrogance could do the job faster. Crowned at just 14, Osman strutted onto the throne, convinced he was the savior of the Ottoman Empire. In reality, he was more like a spoiled teenager given the keys to a tank. Osman dreamed of reform, but his methods were catastrophic. He insulted the Janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, calling them lazy, corrupt, and unfit. To make things worse, he openly threatened to replace them with a new army loyal only to him. Imagine telling your bodyguards they're useless before handing them sharp weapons. It didn't end well. The young sultan also indulged in eccentricities that alienated the court. Obsessed with showing strength, he staged elaborate parades and spectacles, but behind the gold and silk was a boy trying desperately to play emperor. He ignored advice, mocked tradition, treated seasoned generals like schoolchildren. His arrogance didn't just irritate the Janissaries, it enraged them. In 1622, the inevitable happened. The Janissaries revolted, dragging Osman from the throne and locking him in prison. But they didn't stop there. Reports claim he was tortured, humiliated, and finally strangled. The same brutal fate he once applauded for others. The empire learned the hard way. A teenage ego can be as dangerous as any invading army. Osman's reign was short, bloody, and absurd, a cautionary tale of what happens when overconfidence replaces wisdom. His arrogance didn't just cost him his crown, it cost him his life. If Osman's teenage tantrums seem disastrous, wait until you meet Suleiman II, proof that sometimes mediocrity is just as grotesque as madness or arrogance. And tell me in the comments, do you think Osman was doomed by his youth or by his ego? By the time Suleiman II stumbled onto the throne in 1687, the Ottoman Empire was already showing cracks. Unfortunately, he wasn't the kind of ruler to patch them up. Known more for his mediocrity than his brilliance, Suleiman II proved that you don't need madness or arrogance to ruin an empire. Sometimes plain incompetence will do the trick. Unlike his namesake, Suleiman the Magnificent, this sultan was magnificently forgettable. He lacked military skill, political insight, or even the ability to hold the respect of his court. Instead, he surrounded himself with favorites and sycophants, relying on others to manage the empire while he drifted through his reign like a bored guest at his own party. His idea of leadership was letting stronger personalities make decisions while he nodded along, usually half asleep. Suleiman's reign coincided with the Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Vienna and a long period of military decline. While generals and soldiers struggled to hold the frontiers together, their sultan indulged in comfort within the palace. Reports describe him as more interested in wine, luxury, and harem distractions than the fate of his empire. His people needed a warrior; they got a spectator. In the end, Suleiman II left little behind except a reputation for weakness. If history remembers him at all, it's as a cautionary tale of how even ordinary incompetence can be grotesque when multiplied by imperial power. He didn't need to strangle brothers or drown concubines. He strangled the empire slowly through neglect. If Suleiman's mediocrity feels dull, don't worry. Abdulhamid III will prove that paranoia can be just as grotesque as incompetence. If Suleiman II proved that weakness could rot an empire, Abdulhamid II demonstrated that paranoia could suffocate it entirely. Nicknamed the Red Sultan, Abdulhamid ruled in the late 19th century, a time when the Ottoman Empire was desperately trying to modernize. Instead of guiding reforms, he wrapped himself in fear and suspicion, turning the palace into something between a fortress and an asylum. Abdulhamid trusted almost no one. Ministers, courtiers, even his own family lived under the constant gaze of spies. He built an enormous surveillance network where whispers in coffee houses could be reported back to the palace by morning. Imagine living in a city where gossip about the weather might land you on a blacklist. For Abdulhamid, paranoia wasn't a flaw, it was policy. But paranoia alone wasn't grotesque enough. The Sultan also indulged in cruelty. Dissidents were jailed, tortured, or exiled, their only crime being that they thought differently from their ruler. Meanwhile, Abdulhamid obsessed over his image, filling palaces with luxuries while provinces starved. He spent hours micromanaging trivial details like the exact shade of curtains, while ignoring the empire's crumbling borders. By the end of his reign, Abdulhamid had become a caricature of himself, a ruler trapped in his own fears, consumed by control, and blind to the empire's collapse around him. His paranoia didn't preserve the empire, it poisoned it, leaving his successors to clean up the mess. If Abdulhamid's paranoia feels suffocating, brace yourself for our final stop. Murad V, proof that some rulers were too unstable to even hold the throne for long. And before we go there, tell me in the comments, do you think paranoia is worse than madness, or are they equally grotesque when combined with absolute power? If Abdulhamid II smothered the empire with paranoia, Murad V showed the Ottomans what happens when a sultan is simply too fragile for the throne. Crowned in 1876, Murad's reign lasted a grand total of 93 days, the shortest in Ottoman history. In that short time, he managed to prove that sometimes the empire's greatest threat wasn't an enemy army, but its own ruler's unstable mind. Murad had spent years in the shadow of his predecessors, already showing signs of nervous instability. When he finally inherited the throne, the weight of leadership crushed him like a palace ceiling in need of repair. Instead of decisive rule, his court saw panic attacks, mood swings, and an inability to handle even the most basic matters of state. While his predecessors indulged in wine, blood, or paranoia, Murad's vice was something far less dramatic: complete collapse. Foreign diplomats reported that the new sultan could barely keep himself composed during audiences, sometimes breaking into tears or rambling incoherently. Ministers whispered that he was unfit to rule, and the whispers quickly turned into official consensus. Within 3 months, Murad was quietly removed from power and replaced by his brother Abdulhamid II, the paranoid ruler who would cling to the throne for decades. Murad spent the rest of his life in confinement, far from the stage of history, remembered less as a ruler and more as a cautionary tale. His grotesque contribution to the empire wasn't excess or cruelty, but sheer instability, a reminder that even in an age of absolute power, weakness could be just as dangerous as tyranny. If Murad's 93 days felt like a bad joke, the conclusion will show you how all these grotesque habits, madness, drunkenness, paranoia, cruelty, combined to scar the empire forever. From Mehmed the Conqueror's gluttony to Murad Fi's 93 days of collapse, the Ottoman throne was less a seat of wisdom and more a revolving stage for grotesque performances. Each sultan added his own brand of absurdity. Drunken stupors, mass executions, paranoia, madness, or simple incompetence. Together they remind us that the empire's true fragility often came not from foreign invasions, but from the warped habits of the men who ruled it. It's tempting to laugh at their excesses. Selim the Sats slipping in his bath, Ibrahim drowning concubines out of paranoia, but behind the dark humor lies a sobering truth. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it magnifies flaws until they become grotesque. A man who might be tolerable as a neighbor becomes monstrous when handed an empire. The Ottomans built mosques, palaces, and armies that dazzled the world, but they also built a legacy of rulers who scarred their own people with fear, cruelty, and folly. And perhaps the most grotesque habit of all was believing that such power could ever be controlled by one man. So the question remains, when the empire itself is strong but its rulers are weak, what truly holds history together, glory or grotesque?